The Human Stare of History. In 2023, director Christopher Nolan assembled a star-studded cast to depict the life and career of one of the most controversial people in modern history, J. Robert Oppenheimer. The production's scale matched the magnitude of the persona it portrayed. The Trinity test explosion scene was so intense that viewers might instinctively cover their ears from the safety of their seats. At that moment, it'd be hard not to think, now what was it like for Oppenheimer to see that? The answer is surprisingly simple. The explosion devastated its creator's life, forcing him to defend himself for the next 20 years. Being a genius comes with a responsibility to humanity that not everyone can handle. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a man of unconventional mind, needed time to accept his uniqueness. Quiet and introspective from childhood, he underwent an astonishing transformation, becoming vocal about his unpopular opinions and captivating with his intellect. Unfortunately, even the most resilient individuals can break if confronted with a nuclear bomb, metaphorically, of course. In Oppenheimer's case, the authorities stole his creation and turned it into the world's most dangerous and ruthless weapon. Despite his brilliance, Oppenheimer was not a good father to his creation, giving away his most rebellious child, an atomic bomb, to the military in hopes of ensuring peace. But how can fire be water when its very purpose is to burn? If you find yourself seeking answers in Oppenheimer's complicated world, join us on this adventure into the abyss of nuclear Hades, where you'll encounter the blue-eyed stare of the American Prometheus. Key point 2. The life of exclusive variables. Fate smiled upon the father of the atomic bomb for most of his life. Born in America on April 22, 1904, into an upper-class German Jewish family, young Robert had all the makings for success. His father, Julius Oppenheimer, was a man of great perseverance and intellect with varied interests in science and the arts. That said, his two sons, Robert and Frank, inherited not only their father's exquisite intellect, but also his substantial wealth. But unlike his younger brother, Robert also acquired the sensibility and strictness of his artistically prolific mother, Ella. This unique blend of traits contributed to Robert's distinct nervousness and ambivalence that remained with him throughout his life. From a young age, Robert displayed a remarkable array of interests, ranging from minerals and sailing to poetry and painting. Although he excelled in everything he attempted, his scattered focus took a toll on his mental health until he learned to control it. Oppenheimer's education was impressive. He studied at Ethical Culture School, Harvard, Cambridge, and Göttingen in Germany. His time at Harvard, however, was unfruitful, according to the physicist himself. Socially awkward and peculiar at times, Robert spent all his time in intellectual pursuits, ignoring social interactions. His newly discovered love for physics also faced a potential dead end, as he wasn't crafty enough to conduct experiments. The pressure of social isolation and the vocational crisis led to neuroses and depression, as noted by his few friends. Embrace your diverse interests, but seek balance. Success is multifaceted. But as expected of a genius, Robert's interest in psychology made him self-reflective. His mentality thrived through extensive searches for answers in literature and travel. He soon learned to alternate between moments of wild activity and seclusion in nature. This shift led him to the fateful discovery of Los Alamos in New Mexico, a place that played a crucial role in the history of wars and physics. Studying under renowned physicist Max Born in Göttingen in 1926 revitalized Robert's academic career. In Germany, he became fascinated with the burgeoning field of quantum physics, which he would later bring to America. In 1927, he graduated from Göttingen and received numerous job offers from American universities. Among them was Berkeley, a place Robert would turn into a hothouse of quantum physics in the U.S. Did you know? Robert Oppenheimer delivered his first lecture on rock formations to a group of geologists at the tender age of 12. Key point 3. How to get away with communism. In 1929, Robert started his teaching career at UC Berkeley, quickly becoming one of the most eccentric professors there. His early lectures were as chaotic and complex as the physicist himself, baffling his students perplexed by the new subject of quantum physics. But as time passed, he grew his reputation as a prolific scientist and professor, drawing graduates from other prestigious universities like Cambridge or Caltech. Robert was a generous educator who collaborated with his students and recognized their contributions. He fostered an atmosphere of teamwork and joint love of discovery, exemplified by the Nim Nim Boys, a group of Robert's pupils who followed his fashion, tastes, and even their teacher's famous humming, hence the name. His finances also allowed him to treat his colleagues and students with fine food and drinks. Overall, he was no longer a shy, awkward boy, but a confident man who embraced his erudition, albeit sometimes at the expense of public modesty. Despite his colleagues acknowledging his intellect, Robert's curiosity led him to participate in multiple projects simultaneously, as long as they kept his attention. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, he published works on various adjacent topics with astonishing speed. One such paper discussed the idea of neutron stars, published decades ahead of its time. Amidst his academic success, Robert was just as popular. During one public appearance, he met the love of his life. Jean Tatlock was a promising psychiatry student, mirroring Robert intellectually and emotionally. While Jean introduced him to political and social issues as a member of the Communist Party, Robert never identified as a communist himself. He was interested in left-wing ideologies, donating to Republican efforts in other countries, especially during the Spanish Civil War. Initially captivated by the ideals of Soviet communism, Robert found himself disillusioned after listening to the harrowing accounts of George Placzek and Viktor Weisskopf, fellow physicists who had witnessed the terror and repressions in the USSR. When Nazi Germany occupied France in 1940, Oppenheimer was among the few who sensed the grave threat to civilization. Sometimes being an intellectual means exploring both sides of the trenches. Key point 4. How to not get away with communism. At the end of 1939, Jean broke up with Robert, who slowly started seeing other women. At a garden party in Pasadena, he met Kitty Harrison, whose third husband and communist past didn't stop Robert from falling head over heels. An eccentric at work, he was just as surprising in his private life. The couple soon welcomed their first child, Peter. Robert's life seemed perfect until January 29th, 1939, when German chemists Fritz Strassmann and Otto Hahn split the uranium nucleus, which meant only one thing: the race for the atomic bomb was on. So when Nazi Germany attacked the USSR on June 22, 1941, the clock began to tick. That same week, the doors to room 219 in LeConte Hall, the home of Berkeley's first atom collider, opened to devour a young graduate, Joseph Weinberg, and his remarkable mind. Weinberg's exceptional intellect and capabilities earned him Robert's unwavering trust, leading to his inclusion in the Manhattan Project, the ambitious mission to develop an atomic bomb. Unbeknownst to Oppenheimer, Joseph was also a hopeful communist, sharing secret information with Steve Nelson, Kitty's acquaintance and a member of the Communist Party USA, cooperating with Soviet intelligence. While Kitty's loyalty was unquestionable, She had cut her ties with communism long before marrying Robert. The presence of communists in his circle raised concerns, thus complicating his access to the Manhattan Project. Over the next 2 years, Robert gathered top physicists and worked on the atomic bomb in Berkeley and Los Alamos, a city established for the project. Meanwhile, the Counterintelligence Corps investigated communist ties among Oppenheimer's selected scientists. You reap consequences for the friends you choose. As a result, the Secret Service partially blacklisted some of Robert's promising graduates, including Giovanni Lomanitz, Joseph Weinberg, Max Friedman, and David Bohm. Despite having a close friend, Hakan Chevalier, who offered to divulge Soviet information with him in secret, Oppenheimer prioritized his colleague's brilliance. In other words, he did not sympathize with communists and was known to criticize the increasing American compassion for the USSR. While many Americans viewed the Soviet Union as the sole defender against Nazism, Oppenheimer remained wary of its totalitarianism. Key point 5. Sincerity lost between the lines. Communism arguably stalled progress in Los Alamos. After all, the city combined scientific labor and military secrecy. Until 1943, the latter hindered the free exchange of ideas among scientists, impeding significant milestones in the nuclear project due to fear of Soviet spies. Oppenheimer and Officer Leslie Groves, appointed to direct the Manhattan Project, embodied this collision until they compromised and recognized each other's authority. Groves understood the importance of exchanging information within the project for the deadline, reducing access to it as much as possible. Truth be told, Oppenheimer neglected the secrecy, but he knew his leftist views gave Groves strings to pull, so he rarely confronted him. The two men shared mutual respect, recognizing each other's importance in the project's success. However, Oppenheimer couldn't stay silent on matters he cared about, which occasionally worked against him. In August 1943, Robert mentioned Chevalier's purpose for collaboration with the Soviets to Groves, piquing the suspicions of Officer Boris Pash, who monitored the security bridges during the Manhattan Project. Pash's suspicions grew even more when Oppenheimer suddenly advocated for cooperation with the Soviets. As a scientist, Robert believed in peace through shared ideas and worried that nuclear weapons would become a means of inspiring fear in the political arena and facilitating the arms race. Don't waste your honesty on those who may turn it against you. According to Oppenheimer, sharing knowledge with the USSR could mitigate the latter's worry regarding using nuclear weapons against them, thus averting the arms race at its root. The same opinion was shared by Niels Bohr, a Nobel Danish physicist who frequently visited Los Alamos during the war. Knowledge is itself the basis of civilization, but any widening of the borders of our knowledge imposes an increased responsibility on individuals and nations. Niels Bohr. In contrast, Pash didn't recognize the worth of this idea and viewed it as a sign for more intensive surveillance of Oppenheimer. Luckily, Groves trusted Oppenheimer despite his eccentricities, and nothing could draw Robert's attention from the project, not even his newborn daughter. Key point 6. American Prometheus or American Zeus? By the end of 1944, Oppenheimer significantly advanced as a science director in Los Alamos. He confidently reassigned people he considered more suitable, and his colleagues rarely doubted his expertise. However, with the war's end on the horizon, there seemed no time for ethical questions. Scientists in Los Alamos couldn't help discussing the New World Order after the war, which was anything but clear. It was even more unsettling that they started the chain of events that led to this ethical dilemma. The death of Theodore Roosevelt aggravated the existing climate as his successor, Harry Truman, actively pursued a pro-nuclear policy. Meanwhile, in May 1945, Germany surrendered, rendering the atomic bomb seemingly without a target. Despite this, the American military had no intention of shelving the project, which had cost millions of dollars to develop. Thus, on July 16, 1945, the Los Alamos team performed the first man-made nuclear explosion, codenamed Trinity. The resulting light was so intense that it temporarily blinded some of the scientists who watched the explosion without the welder's glass. The explosion became the excellence of human intellect that Los Alamos celebrated that day. But at the same time, it was a weapon of mass destruction, born by the world's brightest minds and given to military forces. The latter and the new president's office treated this addition to the U.S. military arsenal as a tremendous diplomatic weapon. You bear responsibility for your ideas because they're the face of your conscience. Oppenheimer himself agreed that a sole demonstration of a nuclear bomb, whether for the Japanese or Soviets outside the context of war, would likely not dissuade either side from using such weapons in the future. Somehow, he believed a real nuclear attack could end all wars. He also didn't criticize the choice of targets and even instructed the pilots on how to throw nuclear missiles. Only when the cloud of radioactive dust had settled upon the mutilated bodies of Japanese civilians did Robert understand the danger of handing atom power to the military. One suddenly got this horror of all the people that had been killed. Frank Oppenheimer. Key point 7. Facing the dark side of your genius. Using nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki disillusioned many scientists working in Los Alamos, including Oppenheimer. He still believed in sharing knowledge with yesterday's allies. After all, the USSR also had talented physicists who could build the nuclear bomb sooner or later, so the secrecy the American government pursued was redundant. Since World War II's conclusion, Oppenheimer committed himself to advocating for an international agency to supervise the peaceful use of the atom, prohibit its military utilization, and highlight American-Soviet cooperation. The 1946 Acheson-Lilienthal report was the result. However, due to the U.S.'s reluctance to relinquish its nuclear monopoly, the USSR rejected the plan. Robert would soon become disappointed with both sides. The pivotal moment came with the first atomic bomb testing by the Soviets on August 29, 1949. Oppenheimer had no illusions at that time, having turned his mind away from left-wing ideologies. However, what agitated and depressed him was the Truman administration's response. Secretive beyond rationality, the administration's countermeasure was to increase nuclear weapon production. Furthermore, Truman became intrigued with another, more potent bomb called Super, suggested by another Los Alamos scientist, Edward Teller. With Oppenheimer as a chairman, the General Advisory Committee, GAC, helped the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, established in 1946, advised the government against developing such a bomb. But Robert also realized that the Soviets were gaining momentum. At this point, the two countries started a chain of mutual reactions based on inadequate knowledge. While atomic bomb developers, including Oppenheimer, highlighted moral concerns, the Truman administration acted prematurely due to the Soviet experiment, lacking a full grasp of the global risks. That said, from the 1950s until the end of the century, the U.S. spent $5.5 trillion expanding its nuclear arsenal. As for Oppenheimer, Truman was his primary issue, but not the only one. In 1949, House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, investigated notions of atomic spying at Berkeley. The flur of suspicion still followed Robert, but this time he had to be candid about his colleagues, especially former communists. Not everyone forgave him after that. His family life was not exemplary either. Although Oppenheimer tried to be a loving father, he and his wife couldn't connect to their children wholeheartedly. Being a genius in one sphere often means lacking in another. Key point 8. The last battles. The following 2 decades of Oppenheimer's life took him from pariah to martyr in the scientific community. One thing that never changed about Robert was his protests against testing new nuclear weapons like enhanced bomber aircraft. He was appalled by the Air Force's 1951 strategic war plan that suggested annihilating entire cities in the USSR. Being vocal about the need for an open atom exploitation policy, Robert gained followers and enemies. Lewis Strauss, a member of the AEC and later its chairman in the 1950s, was his most ruthless opponent. He staunchly advocated for secretive atomic developments and the pursuit of hydrogen bombs. The man exploited every opportunity, even resorting to slander, to tarnish Oppenheimer's reputation. This behavior was particularly evident after Oppenheimer mocked Strauss's stance against exporting isotopes for medical use during a session of the U.S. Senate. Ambitious and sensitive, Strauss did everything possible to vilify Oppenheimer. Even the strongest people can break, so pretending to be one will only hurt you. What followed was a 4-week investigation of Robert's security and communist affiliations amid the 1954 anti-communist hysteria, both genuine and unfounded. His case featured his brother Frank and wife Kitty, former communists, in the headlines. Strauss ensured that Chevalier's ambiguous proposal to share technical information with the Soviets back in 1943 presented Robert in the most suspicious of lights. On top of that, the FBI monitored his movements as well as illegally tapped his phone and used those transcripts during the hearing. Strauss went as far as to influence President Eisenhower against Robert and order defaming articles about him. However, Oppenheimer also had enough support from his fellow scientists like David Lilienthal, Enrico Fermi, and General Leslie Groves. Oppenheimer's lawyers had no access to confidential material that prosecutors relied on during the hearing. Eventually, Robert's clearance was annulled, cutting his ties with the government. His reputation suffered, but not as severely as Strauss had hoped. Oppenheimer continued his career as a director of Princeton's Institute of Advanced Study, a position he received back in 1947. Unfortunately, decades of smoking caught up with him in the form of throat cancer in 1965, undermining the last years of his scientific path. The man's appearance and behavior changed tremendously after the hearing and the diagnosis. The father of the atomic bomb passed away on February 18, 1967, leaving his achievements for the world to judge. Conclusion. Few people have brought something to the fore as controversial as J. Robert Oppenheimer. The man who developed the atomic bomb was as extraordinary as his invention. From a very young age, Robert had a unique approach to everything. Who knows if the world would be the way it is today if this man chose another life path? After all, he was a man of numerous interests, so it's ironic that his choice fell on something we hardly associate with morals, physics, yet it challenged the ethics of the whole nation. At the same time, who else could stand up to the test if not Oppenheimer, who went through an immense transformation and whose left-wing opinions often left him vulnerable to critique? Born into privilege, he never used it to buy himself a step up the ladder. Instead, he faced his imperfections and grew into a better brother, teacher, scientist, and leader. He wasn't a perfect parent, but he had the courage to acknowledge it and do his best. He applied this principle to his work in Los Alamos, unfortunately getting caught up in his own conscience. Hiroshima and Nagasaki divided his life into 2 halves. Confident but naive in the first, he faced the consequences in the second. J. Robert Oppenheimer may have become the American Prometheus, But he soon learned you shouldn't give fire to those who want to play with it. Try this. Watch the To End All War, Oppenheimer and the Atomic Bomb, 2023 documentary on the life and work of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Watch The Bomb, a 2015 documentary about the history and influence of nuclear missiles on our lives.